Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey. Good evening from Israel. It's Israel's 74th Independence Day. For those who are celebrating Chag Sameach or Din Simcha. I'm going to just start for a few minutes. We've been doing this for a couple of years, and we talk quite a lot about Israeli politics, and certainly over the last 2 years, its dysfunctionality, how disorderly it is, how dysfunctional it is, how problematic it is at times to make decisions. And we've spoken a little bit about that, but I think maybe now would be an opportune time just to sort of take a step backwards. Where we were at the beginning of Israel's independence and where we've been for the last year. And part of the reason that we have so much to talk about every week is partly because of Israel's government system, political system, electoral system. And we've mentioned in the past that it came from the Weimar Republic, and the idea at the beginning of the state was to take a very fractured Israeli society. Don't forget there were people coming from over 100 countries, speaking dozens of different languages, coming from different cultures, different geographic locations, having different experiences. As one can imagine, it was a very unwieldy society. But the most important thing about this society that we should remember when we look back 74 years is that not one single Israeli, or maybe a tiny, tiny fraction of Israeli society, had any experience of democracy, whether they came from North Africa, the Middle East, under Arab rule, whether they came from former Soviet Union, whether they came from Nazi Germany or other areas under occupation. Very, very few Israelis at the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 had any experience of democracy. So it really was a blank slate for many. And it's quite remarkable thinking 74 years ahead, how I've created one of the most robust, as I said, sometimes dysfunctional, but certainly robust liberal democracies in the world, especially in an area, in a region where simply, is pretty unheard of. So, as much as we like to talk about, what's going on and the dysfunctionality and the negative side of politics, we have to also look at the glass half full. And after 74 years, there's been quite a lot of achievements, whether it's Israel as an OECD country, whether it's being the strongest country, defense and security-wise in the nation, facing ongoing threats, some of them seemingly unsurmountable. And today there's a lot that Israel can be pretty proud of, especially if we look over the last year. There's some to be proud. There's some certain ups and downs. The first thing we can look at is the fact that we have a government since last year, since last Israel's Independence Day. We had 4 elections that achieved no results and no government. But finally, we had a government, probably one of the most unexpected governments in Israel's history, certainly the widest coalition in Israel's history, encompassing more parties than there ever has been, and certainly encompassing the wider spectrum of Israeli parties, from an Arab Islamist party, the first ever Arab party in an Israeli government, the far left Meretz, Labour, Blue and White, Yesh Atid, Tikva Chadasha, Yamina, Israel Beitenu. It's quite an unwieldy government, but it's almost coming to a year. We'll talk a little bit about that. Who would have thought a number of years ago there'd be 4 Arab foreign ministers meeting in Sde Boker, the resting place of Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, but 4 foreign ministers coming to Israel for a summit along with the US Secretary of State, Blinken, to discuss how to move forward in peace and security. It's something which simply unthinkable a number of years ago. This year has also seen a reset with Turkey. One can't imagine one just following Turkey-Israel relations for the last decade, but before that, certainly before President Erdogan, Israel and Turkey had excellent relations, and really together, that piece was the foundational pillar, one of the foundational pillars of peace and stability in the region. Well, it's, things have not moved back to there, certainly, and they probably won't, at least in the foreseeable future. But certainly Turkey has understood that it needs to have close relations with Israel, whether it's through gritted teeth or not, that's certainly a debate to be had, but certainly there's an interest now in Turkey to reset relations to move on a more positive path. On the negative side, we have seen certain things that we have not seen before. We have seen rocket attacks on Jerusalem from Hamas, but certainly not at the level that we saw last year, especially around Jerusalem Day. The threats that Hamas have made since then, the gains, one could argue that they've made on the Temple Mount and even in Judea and Samaria and West Bank Palestinian society. We're seeing those even up to today, with Sinwar, one of the military leaders of Hamas, making threats against Israel. Again, the kind of threats that we wouldn't have necessarily heard worded in the way that we're hearing them today. Another first, maybe not first, but certainly first in a while, we saw this year again, going back to the war of last year, as we saw many very serious battles, conflict within mixed Arab and Israeli cities, whether in Ramle, Lod, Haifa, and other places. Really, the relations in some of these places between Jewish and Muslim Arab neighbors has not been reset, has not gone back to where it was. There's still a lot of fear, trepidation. There's still a sense of unease in many of these cities. So that's certainly a negative that we saw throughout the last year. Moving on to today's events, and what we saw today really is indicative of where we are, perhaps in Israeli political discourse with the divisions. We saw a prime minister get up to speak at the annual Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Memorial Day, Israel's Remembrance Day for its fallen in wars and victims of terrorist attacks. And always there's a national and public ceremony where the families of those who have fallen and victims of terror will listen to the president, the prime minister, and others. And we saw Naftali Bennett get up to speak, and he was verbally assaulted by some members of the audience. There weren't that many, but it doesn't take too many to create a major disturbance, and that's kind of what happened. Bennett kept his cool. He got a lot of plaudits from the media for that. One can imagine, it's an impossible situation. He can't say anything to calm the situation. They can't really remove these people. They are families of people who've lost loved ones, so you have to be very, very sensitive. So for around 6 minutes, he sat there. He looked at them. He didn't turn away. He didn't try and do anything except just to say, I understand your pain. And when it comes to the families of the fallen, you can say and shout whatever you want. And he actually did quite well, considering. There was also a less vociferous reception for other members of the government. There were some members of organizations representing the families of those who had fallen who said that government members are not welcome. The main organizations, the overwhelming majority, did accept, and in fact, some of them even apologized to Naftali Bennett. But it really goes to show, where our political discourse is, because it obviously, one can imagine that it sets a bad precedent. Not to say that Naftali Bennett is the first Israeli prime minister who was heckled at these events. Former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was heckled also previously, but it was one or two individuals, and it didn't last particularly long. So certainly what we saw today are scenes that are unprecedented in Israel, and the fact that such an important event for so many, it's a central event in Israel's national calendar, was interrupted for such a long time. The prime minister was interrupted, and he was called all manner of problematic things, which I'm not going to repeat, really just shows where we are. Onto politics, because We're having next week the opening of the summer session of the Knesset, and this has been eagerly awaited by all sides, perhaps by some less than others. But it's a crucial period because since the Knesset last met, we've seen the coalition's majority go from a majority of one to no majority at all. As we've said previously, it's now 60-60 in the Knesset because of Edith Silman of Yamina's defection. It remains to be seen exactly how she's going to vote. If she's going to abstain, then the coalition still has a majority and it's able to pass certain laws, not basic laws, which have a quasi-constitutional presence, because for there you need at least 61 votes. So it's clear that that's not going to happen, as is the budget not going to happen next year, which also requires 61. But if Silman abstains on certain laws, then they can still pass. And when she was asked during an interview earlier in the week how she's going to vote, she was very non-definitive. She tried to avoid the question. She did talk about that she felt let down. She wanted to give this government a chance. And then when she saw that what she felt that it wasn't living up to its promise, she didn't specify what specifically she felt let down by, but it was very carefully curated with talking points that were just repeated by Silman throughout the interview. But it was interesting that she was non-definitive exactly how she's going to act in the future. So it remains to be seen. Ram, as we know, are still officially in a temporary boycott of the government. It's been very easy to boycott a government or Knesset that hasn't been meeting. So next week it's going to have to decide what it's going to do. There's a bit of an inner struggle there, as we talked about. There's 4 members, 2 would like to quit the government or are moving towards that position, and 2 would like to remain, including Mansour Abbas, the leader. So it remains to be seen. They have their demands. It's unclear exactly how strong they will be on these demands and whether they've been met yet. We haven't heard either way, but in the next few days, Ram will have to make a decision. The coalition has basically given out orders to its members of Knesset, or 60 of them, that they have to be there for at least the next 3 weeks. There are no excuses, no trips abroad, nothing. Every single MK has to appear at every single session. Only after the initial 3 weeks will they have permission perhaps to leave, only if they are offset by a member of the opposition. And we've talked about that before, this whole concept of being, offsetting one side to the other. In previous Knessets, usually if someone is away, maybe they're on an official trip, or maybe they have some personal reason, they're away for a vote, usually they go to the other side of the aisle and then someone drops out from that. It's a well-known custom in Israel, but certainly in recent years, with the divisiveness of Israeli politics, there's been a lot of hesitation to do so. We've had all those, crazy events where people had to leave, a funeral of a close family member, they had to leave hospital beds, they had to come from the birthing maternity ward sometimes to the Knesset plenum to make sure that they voted, because the other side would not offset. So the fact that they're saying for the next 3 weeks they have to turn up to every session, there's no offsetting, remains to be seen what's going to change suddenly over these 3 weeks. The interesting thing is, having met and spoken with a number of members of Knesset, ministers in the coalition over the last week or so, there is an optimism, there is a confidence that this coalition will last the session. Because when it lasts the session, then we're into the summer break, and then we've got the Jewish holidays. So, there's a good chance that it could last another few months. So there is that confidence. I'm not 100% sure if it's an accurate confidence. I think everyone is just waiting to see what happens. My personal belief, and I've stated this before, is that because everyone knows that this government, this Knesset, has a sell-by date next March, it has to fall unless something dramatic happens, because simply will not be able to pass the budget. Everyone knows that this is going to force that everyone's going to start thinking, what is my individual or my party position? Or how am I going to go into the next elections? Do I have an issue over it? Do I quit the coalition over an issue? Do I make it an ideological issue? Do I get any achievements first? All these things will be going through not just the minds of the leaders of the party, but every single individual MK. And because it's not a slim majority, there is no majority, but because of this situation, every single MK will be able to hold the government to ransom. So it'll be very interesting to see how the summer session begins, because I think then we'll get a bit of a sense whether this coalition can still work together, can still muddle through the summer session. And then maybe we'll get an idea if it could survive before the end of the year. Again, my feeling is that we will have elections in Israel before the end of the year. It just depends exactly when that will be. But that's certainly something to look out for basically starting next week. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So first one in is from Carrie Hillebrand. In light of Lavrov's comments and the aftermath, do you see Russia withdrawing from or limiting the deconfliction agreement in Syria?
Well, certainly that comment got a lot of attention. I can imagine for those who don't know what is being referred to, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in an interview, I can't remember which station it was with, asked him about this whole idea of denazification, which is the Russian narrative they've been pushing since the beginning of their invasion of Ukraine. And the interviewer said, well, Zelensky, President Zelensky is Jewish, so how can you talk about denazification? And Foreign Minister Lavrov came out with some, bizarre comments, to say the least, that, we know that many of the worst anti-Semites in history have actually been Jews, and even I can't remember if he was an equivalent about it, but basically suggested that Hitler also had Jewish blood. As one can imagine, this created quite a lot of attention, a lot of blowback from Israeli and Jewish organizations. Even Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who's tried to be cautious with the response towards Russia, came out with a quite scathing response. The Russians doubled down on those remarks. Foreign Minister Lapid summoned the Russian ambassador in Israel for dressing down, and they agreed ostensibly in that meeting that they would leave it at that. But the Russians, as I said, the Russian foreign ministry doubled down on the comments and basically attacked Israel for its reaction. I think certainly Israel is moving further and further away from Russia, closer and closer to Ukraine. I think non-coincidentally, senior members of Hamas were in Moscow to discuss relations in the last couple of days, or they're invited to come in the next couple of days. And I think in that, not to say that Hamas officials have not visited Moscow in the past, but I think in that there is a message, subtle or not. And I think it depends what level of reception the Hamas officials get and what level of access they get to Russian leaders will send a message to Israel, what level of dissatisfaction there is. But certainly with every passing day, Israel is moving away from that position of trying to be a mediator, trying to not necessarily remain neutral, but at least trying not to annoy the Russians because of the issue in Syria that was referred to in the question. But it's becoming increasingly difficult at this point.
And do you think that this will be one of the top questions or discussions in the Knesset once the session resumes?
The question of Russia? No, I mean, foreign policy issues are not necessarily brought up in the Knesset. That's not really the right forum. There is a Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee, but again, I don't know if that's really an issue where the opposition and the coalition differ. Both sides, especially as the opposition were in power for the last 13 years, They understand the constraints, and I don't think that they'll make too much political hay out of that, because they understand what's being said, and no one's going to defend the comments of Lavrov or the reaction, or criticize necessarily the reaction of Israeli leaders. So I don't think that will necessarily be one of the major talking points in the Knesset when it reopens.
Understood. Thank you. And for our viewers, just a reminder that we do have our Q&A box if you'd like to ask a question. The next one is Barak Korkmaz asks, what do you think about the U.S. estimates on Iranian nuclear program? They say Iran is weeks away from the bomb.
Well, I think to a certain extent, the US has now adopted what Israel has been saying for quite a while. Israel has been saying, I remember Defense Minister Benny Gantz saying it a number of months ago, that Iran is only weeks away. Again, let's get a few things straight. They're not a few weeks or even a few months away from a nuclear bomb. They are a few weeks away from having enough material for a nuclear weapon. Obviously, being able to then militarize it and attach it to a missile and testing, that can take up to 2 years, from my understanding. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but that's my understanding. But certainly the weaponization, or to get to a weaponization level of uranium, we are probably talking about a few weeks, a few months. So I don't think there's anything particularly new in that, especially for Israel. What is interesting, which on that particular issue, is the fact that also the US has come around to Israel's point of view on the Revolutionary Guards. If we remember, a couple of months ago, there was talk that the Biden administration may remove the Iranian Revolutionary Guards from its list of terrorist organizations. That was one of the Iranian demands, to return to the JCPOA. And as one can imagine, there was great consternation in Israel. Israel tried to make the case very strongly to the Biden administration. In the end, the Joint Chief of Staff, the US Joint Chief of Staff, said that he was against it. But what we have heard in recent days, which is very interesting as well, plays into sort of the local domestic political arena, is that Naftali Bennett hinted, or at least he was accused of leaking, reports that Israel basically thwarted some assassination attempts of Israeli, American, and I think European officials. And some of the information was gleaned from interrogation of senior Revolutionary Guard within Iran. Now, that's quite a remarkable feat to achieve, that you would go into Iran and interrogate them and glean that information. That served a number of things for Bennett. First of all, it showed the Americans how dangerous the Iranian Revolutionary Guards are, but it also said to the Israeli public, I'm prepared to do things that are a little bit outside the box. I can also be daring. I can also, conduct operations that will ensure Israel's security. So there's quite a lot of debate about that, whether that was really to ensure the Americans do not delist the Revolutionary Guards, or whether it was purely a political stunt. Either way, it could have achieved both aims. Certainly was a little bit of a win for Bennett. And the fact that the Americans now seem to have moved away from that position completely is also perhaps telling that perhaps the negotiations are going nowhere, some suspect, and at the moment there is no return to the JCPOA in sight.
Thank you. And then you were talking about if the budget will not be passed, so this government has a sell-by date. Are there any not so behind the scenes relationships being formed between different parties to look forward to a new coalition government?
There's always discussions, there's always meetings, and the media get very excited when someone from this party and someone from that party is sitting together. And there's always outreach. I mean, it's Likud and its allies are spending an inordinate amount of time trying to identify at least one member of Yamina, perhaps Tikva Chadasha, Gidon Saar's party, New Hope, to try and bring one more across, because as one can imagine, if one more person comes across, then the opposition have a majority to be able to pass a law of no confidence, which would bring down the government and force new elections. So there's this outreach is happening all the time. Any sort of leads that are happening, any family members, as we saw with Edith Tillman, any spiritual leaders, any friends, any community leaders, anything that can put pressure on any of these members who are seen as weaker links is happening all the time. And I'm sure some of these meetings are taking place. At the moment, it doesn't seem that anyone's ready to jump yet, but obviously, as we saw with Edith Tillman, we can all be surprised, from 1 hour to the next. So that certainly remains to be seen.
Thank you. And if ROM does decide to continue with its boycott, what will that mean for any voting going forward?
Well, it means that the government not only will not be able to pass any laws, and don't forget there are some laws which already passed their first reading and they're ready for the second and third reading. They're basically usually one after the other. So some of these laws that were passed to the point where they're just ready to become law now will have no chance, even if RAM do turn up and vote. Again, if everybody on both sides votes on every single issue, then nothing will be passed because a tie will not pass a law. But more than that, if they decide to boycott, then potentially the opposition could start passing laws to embarrass the government. But don't forget, in the opposition still remains a party of 6, which is the Joint Arab List of Ayman Odeh, Ahmed Tibi, which won't necessarily want to give a prize, and perhaps there aren't that many issues in which they will agree with Netanyahu's right-wing religious ultra-Orthodox bloc. So it's uncertain, but certainly there is an interest in them working together to embarrass the government. Perhaps on issues, they've worked together on issues of interest for the Joint Arab List and even what's for some of the ultra-Orthodox parties. So it's possible that they'll be able to find some common ground to embarrass the government and try and pass some laws.
Thank you. Eric asks, what is happening with the Netanyahu trials?
They're still going on. We spoke a few weeks ago, Filber, who was a former senior advisor to Netanyahu, is taking the stand. And so far, he is considered a very problematic witness for the prosecution because he seems to have gone back on many of the things that he said during his interrogation, whatever you want to talk about. He is considered a state witness because he has agreed to testify on behalf of the state to get a better deal for himself, because he also was accused of some crimes, and that was the deal. But at the moment, he's certainly not giving everything the prosecution would like. But again, it's still, they're still going through. I can't remember what number Filber is, but he is still one of the early witnesses on a very long list of witnesses. So nothing necessarily will happen for quite a while because there's a lot of witnesses to go through. Don't forget, there's 3 cases to go through. So the whole trial will take a very long time, if not years. So there's not that much happening. There's some interesting tidbits that the media report on, that especially surrounding Filber's testimony, as I said, because the state thought that they could rely on some of his testimony, and now he's claiming that it didn't happen exactly as he stated, or he can't remember exactly, or even going a little bit further. And there's a debate whether the prosecution want to characterize him as a hostile witness and strike some of his testimony. They haven't gone that far yet, but if he carries on or even goes further than he has, it could be that we'll get to that stage.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We're just shy of the close of the webinar, so we might as well end now. So thank you so much for taking time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Ori Wertman. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.